The private security firm Blackwater has been in the news a lot lately, having been accused of killing civilians in Iraq. There's many stories, though, that have not been told about Blackwater, but have been compiled by investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill in his new book, Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. I had the opportunity today to sit down with Jeremy to discuss Blackwater and what hasn't quite made it into the mainstream media. You write a book on Blackwater, and really the crux of the issue, I think, for our viewers who I'm sure know about Blackwater already, is that mercenary armies, private contractors are being used around the world. What's the real danger here?
Well, I think what we're really looking at is a subversion of the international structure. We're talking about companies now, some of which have military forces that could take out a small nation. And really what this is a disintegration of the nation state. Right now in Iraq alone, the U.S. government has 630 corporations on its payroll. There are over 170 mercenary companies operating in Iraq. Blackwater perhaps is the most prominent of them, but there are over 170 other companies. That's almost as many nations as there are registered at the UN. So what we're really looking at here is a situation where the monopoly that governments have held on the use of organized violence or force or war, it's now in private hands, open to the highest bidder.
And is that the case we're seeing that in Iraq. We know about Blackwater in Iraq, but there's laws against using military in the United States. What is it?
Well,
with
the use of these kinds of forces like Blackwater in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina really is a backdoor subversion of posse comitatus, which is the U.S. law which prohibits the active duty military from engaging in domestic law enforcement. And to me, this is one of the most disturbing trends that we're seeing in the country right now, is toward a paramilitarization of the police and then a use of veterans of the military, of the special forces community, to deploy on U.S. soil.
Now, you write in your book about Congressman Kucinich asking questions about the legality and if Blackwater could be prosecuted for murders in Iraq. Now, you're saying that they're being used in the United States. Is their legal status as ambiguous when they're, say, under Homeland Security contract in New Orleans?
I've interviewed over the past, let's say, year and a half or so, a number of constitutional law experts, and to them this is a very problematic area. It's unclear what the legal structure is for the deployment of these kinds of forces on U.S. soil. Technically, they're contractors of the federal government, and so in theory they then are serving as agents of the federal government. But when you're talking about heavily armed paramilitary type forces that are on government contract who are also veterans of the U.S. military, it raises questions about posse comitatus. It also raises questions about civil liberties and constitutional rights. Are these individuals who are being deployed officially and formally trained in protecting people's civil liberties and civil rights when they encounter them and they're working for the U.S. government? Unfortunately, it hasn't been legally challenged yet, and I think that we're going to see lawsuits aimed at these private military companies, not just for their conduct in Iraq, but for their increased use at home. It's desperately needed.
What are some of the things that we don't hear about Blackwater? We hear about Blackwater in Iraq. Mm-hmm. We hear about Blackwater in New Orleans, and that's scraped the mainstream media to an extent. What is Blackwater doing that nobody knows?
What Blackwater is doing right now, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of this, is they're building up a parallel structure to the U.S. national security apparatus. They recently started an intelligence division called Total Intelligence Solutions. It's being headed by 3 veterans of the Central Intelligence Agency: Cofer Black, who headed the CIA's counterterrorism center after 9/11, the guy who promised President Bush that he would have Osama bin Laden's head whacked off and placed in a cardboard box in dry ice and brought back to the United States. He oversaw the Extraordinary Rendition Program as well, the government kidnap and torture program. Robert Richer, the former Deputy Director of Operations at Central Intelligence, Enrique Rick Prado, a veteran CIA operative. Those 3 guys are now heading Eric Prince's private intelligence company.
And is this intelligence company based in the U.S.?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's based in the U.S., and they're marketing their services to Fortune 500 companies. And the B2B aspect of this, so the business-to-business aspect of it, is a whole new frontier. And then it raises all sorts of questions about regulation and oversight, et cetera. Mm-hmm.
And you've referred to some of these techniques as asymmetric warfare, 4th-generation warfare. What do you mean by this exactly?
Well, it has to do with the idea of enemies or parties to a conflict that are not organized under the banner of a nation state or under a flag or as part of an official military. And so when you're engaged in asymmetric warfare, at times you have a military that then has to fight against an entity that is not a nation, not a military, doesn't wear uniforms. And so then you get into the whole world of counterinsurgency and black ops and covert operations. And what we're seeing here, if we step back from it in the bigger picture, is that what you have in a company like Blackwater is in some cases a force that is more elite than the most elite forces of the U.S. military, because you're taking people who are veteran Navy SEALs or Delta Force guys, and then you're giving them even more specialized training, and they have incredible weaponry, and then they're being deployed in Iraq for very mission-critical operations. And when they're working on the U.S. government payroll, that's one thing, which I think is very disturbing. But what if those services then get farmed out to a private company that hires them? Now we're getting into some really frightening territory, because you're talking about entities whose entire existence is based on a profit motive, then hiring their own paramilitary forces that in some cases are more elite than the most elite units of the U.S. military. It's scary stuff.
That leads us into a criticism that I think could be viewed as a fair criticism. Tucker Carlson, a couple weeks ago on Bill Maher's show, referring to Blackwater, said, well, who's going to do it? Why shouldn't a private corporation be allowed to hire another private corporation for protection in Iraq? For example, he brought up the New York Times. So if the New York Times is operating in a dangerous area, why shouldn't they have the best private security they can get?
What happens when the New York Times is riding in its convoy with its mercenaries, and some Iraqi civilians get too close to them and they shoot them up? Well, they can't be prosecuted under Iraqi law. They haven't been prosecuted under U.S. civilian law. They haven't been prosecuted under U.S. military law. And so then you have a situation where the New York Times is actually using militias or vigilantes who end up perhaps killing civilians. But I mean, that's only a practical argument. In the bigger picture, when people say that, well, who else is going to do it? If Blackwater's not guarding the diplomats in Iraq, someone has to guard them. No, someone doesn't have to guard them, because that whole idea presumes that we should be in Iraq in the first place. That Blackwater works for the State Department under a program that almost no one knows about. It's called the WPPS, the Worldwide Personal Protective Service. It's diplomatic security. When it was originally envisioned, the Diplomatic Security Division was supposed to be specially trained people who were engaged in executive protection, that were going to keep U.S. diplomats protected in countries around the world. Now in Iraq, all of a sudden, you don't just have an ambassador and a couple of deputies. You have hundreds and hundreds of personnel who are being guarded by thousands of mercenaries from Blackwater, Triple Canopy, and DynCorp. It's like a Frankenstein project. And what this program has basically become is an armed wing of the administration. The only reason why these kinds of forces are necessary in Iraq is because it's an offensive, aggressive war of conquest that is unpopular at home and all over the world. If it was a war of national defense or a war based on world stability, you would have a coalition of willing nations. You wouldn't need a coalition of billing corporations. You would have had international diplomacy instead of the no-bid contract.
One last thing, you constantly refer to what Blackwater calls private security companies as mercenaries. Why the rhetoric in there? Why do that? Why not just call them private security contracts?
I mean, I think that it's important I think it's important to name them for what they are. I mean, these are people that have been paid billions of dollars in public funds to engage in armed activities around the world. And they are not just Americans working for America. We're talking about a company that has hired up commandos from countries around the world and deployed them for one reason and one reason alone. They want to make a lot of money. That's the very essence of being a mercenary. In fact, Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, defines mercenary as a professional soldier serving a foreign power. That's exactly who the troops working for Blackwater are when they're drawn from all around the world. But I think we need to get away from the technical definition of it, because what we're really talking about here is using forces for offensive purposes. Blackwater is not a defensive security force in Iraq. It's at the vanguard of the occupation of another company, and it's doing for profit. And so I think it's important to label them what they are, and that is a mercenary operation. I have no problem with talking about them being a private military company or a private security company or calling them contractors, except it sanitizes it and makes it sound as though they're water specialists or humanitarian workers when we say contractors, or that they're engaged in construction. They're not. Their business is killing, and they're mercenaries.
Whether they're called private security companies or mercenaries, what is clear is both the private and government sector will continue to outsource what has formerly been the role of the American military. This has been Geoff Millard reporting for truthout.org.